with Pia Justesen. She's the author of From the Periphery, Real Life Stories of Disability. She's also a human rights lawyer. And if I understand correctly, you're based in Denmark, but also spend time in Chicago, correct?
All right.
All right. Got it. So I have to tell you that this book really changed the way that I see the world. And I'm curious what your goals were for the book.
So when I talk to people with disabilities, they always tell me that bias and preconceived ideas about people with disabilities is one of the sort of biggest impediments to genuine equality. So I wanted to work with that, really to try to promote genuine equality for people with disabilities by promoting awareness. So, I mean, I am a lawyer. I've been doing a lot of legal work, and this is not a very legal approach, but I wanted these individual narratives to sort of shed a light on not only the diverse lives of people with disabilities, but even more so the barriers that the majority population put around people with disabilities. That was really my goal.
Yeah. And you chose that narrative sort of structure for your book. Can you talk a little bit more about why you felt that was the way to go, an important structure to choose?
I think individual narratives are so powerful for, for understanding the real situation of a person. I mean, if you want to get a better understanding of how it is to be a person with a disability, if you want to take a walk in those shoes of individuals with disabilities, I mean, you just need to hear more about their lives. And I think the individual narratives are really powerful in that way. The storytelling part that's a powerful means.
Yeah. So people with disabilities make up the largest minority in the world, as I understand it, but yet, unlike race, ethnicity, or gender, it's not really acknowledged always as a human rights issue. Why is that?
I think people always talk about disability rights as something very special, something that's different from human rights. But when you look at human rights, they are rights for everybody, for every person in the world, including people with disabilities. So it's really about a right to a life, and a right to a life in dignity. And that obviously includes people with disabilities. So disability rights are human rights. And we also have to acknowledge that people with disabilities have, their rights are not always respected. When we look globally, when we look at the situation in the US and in also a wealthy country like Denmark, a lot of individuals with disabilities are denied their rights in practice. They are not being part of the labor market. Their right to privacy is being violated. Their right to protection of health and social security is being violated. There are just a number of human rights issues when we talk about the group of people with disability. So I think it's important to really underline that people with disabilities might have special needs, but they have human rights like everybody else that are really basic.
Yeah. I've heard a lot of conversation about the term special needs, and I think the way that one self-advocate put it is, well, my needs are just like your needs. They're not special.
Exactly.
Yeah. What do you think people most misunderstand about disability or these issues?
I think people, when they hear the word disability, they often think about a medical diagnosis or an illness. And I look at disability through human rights lenses. So I see disability as something that occurs if you might have an individual impairment. And when there are barriers in the surroundings, the interaction between your individual impairment and those barriers is really what creates the disability. In other words, you can say if there are no barriers in the world, there are no people with disabilities. There might be some people with individual impairments, but they don't have a disability. And I think that's really important to underline.
So many of the people you included in the book or spoke with have experienced that kind of invisibility and isolation. And can you talk a little bit more about how that affects their lives and the way that you were able to get into that in the book through their personal stories?
I think if you have those experiences all through your life, there is a great risk that you internalize it, that you become a person who is less than, just less valuable than everybody else, because you keep meeting, lack of respect, lack of inclusion. If you're a child, you might be bullied in schools. You might not get the assistance and the accommodations that you need to be fully included and to get a proper education. And for adults, it's really lack of employment, lack of access to public places, just a lot of negative attention. And if you experience that all through your life, it's really not difficult to understand that you internalize it. So that obviously affects a lot of people with disabilities, and not everybody internalizes it, but it's definitely a thing that happens to many people.
I think that really is a great way to seg into another question I have, which is that anger is an emotion that people you included in the book frequently mention.
Yeah.
And so much of it seems to come from this feeling that society requires them to prove their humanity. And I'm wondering why you felt it, a little bit more about why you felt it was so important to include that emotion of anger in the stories, because I think maybe some people might have hesitated about that.
I think it's important to say that not everybody internalizes that they're less than. A lot of people actually get angry. They argue that disability is not miserable, but not being regarded, not being respected, just being constantly seen as less than, not being treated with dignity. All that is miserable. So these barriers in the world can make living with a disability a very miserable life. And that's why people with disability get angry, or at least some people with disability get angry, and they fight to change the world. They fight to, pull down those barriers so they can actually get genuine equal opportunities just like everybody else. And I really didn't want the reader to pity people with disabilities. That's very, very important to me. I want the reader to respect people with disability as a very diverse group of individuals, and just get a better understanding of, if we can move down those barriers, people with disabilities do not have to live these miserable lives.
I know that you work with an organization, or you have worked with an organization in Chicago, where you did first encounter some people you included in the book. And it sounds like these are the kinds of people that you're talking about who are fighting for change.
Yeah. A lot of them, that was really how I started this work. I started interviewing some of my colleagues in this organization, Access Living. And they are fighting to change the world and to pull down those barriers and to work really to promote the equal protection of people with disabilities. And they sort of use their anger in their activism. And a lot of people that I spoke to there said that the anger was in that way useful, because it really, gave them the power to work for change.
So at least for me as a reader, I think this book really evokes strong emotions for readers because of how deeply personal and raw some of these stories are. And I'm wondering how you approach those conversations, given that you are not a person with a disability.
It was something that I thought a lot about, because I am a white woman. I am privileged. I don't have a disability myself, and I was very concerned about my position doing this kind of work. But at the same time, I wanted to use my knowledge of human rights, and I was, and I still am, very concerned about developments in the world with less, as at least it looks like now, respect for different groups of minorities in society. I want really my own children to grow up in a society where we respect diversity and where we tolerate each other and are interested and curious about each other, in spite of all these differences that we have. So this worry about racism and ableism and sexism in society and my background in human rights work sort of convinced me that I did have knowledge and some resources that I could use to help facilitate these narratives come out. And I also realized that my outsider position, you can say, made it possible for me to ask a lot of stupid questions, because there were a lot of things that I didn't know about, both as a foreigner, a Dane coming from a very different society than the American, but also from my very privileged position. There were a lot of questions I could ask. And I think for other outsiders to understand the barriers that we as a majority put around people with disabilities, often without knowing it, I think, that was a useful position for me to have, because I was able to learn a lot myself and help others to learn as well. And I think the main argument was that people that I spoke to, and when I asked them if they wanted to share their stories, they found it important to facilitate this knowledge and share their stories. And if they hadn't done so, I obviously wouldn't have written the book. Yeah.
Got it. So I know after law school in Denmark, you spent a year working as a personal assistant for a young man who uses a wheelchair. And I'm curious how that shaped your work and your views on disability, at least at the start.
So I did work as a personal assistant, and it was a very new kind of work for me. I didn't know anybody with a disability before then, so I had to learn a lot. And we would do many things during the day. We would go out and about, and there were so many places that were inaccessible for a wheelchair user like Torben. So he was left out, and obviously I was left out with him. And I was angry, but I didn't really at that time see it as a human rights issue, even though I was very engaged in Amnesty International, but I just didn't really, it didn't click for me at that time. But obviously I started thinking and wondering, and I took that knowledge with me. And when I became involved in disability rights in the movement, you can say later, I fully understood the human rights implications of that inaccessibility in Denmark at that time. So it was important for me, but I didn't at the time really realize how important it was. It was sort of, some seeds were being, put in my brain. Yeah.
That's how most things are, I think.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So I know one of the disability rights activists that you interviewed talked about how she doesn't want to accept what she called a shrunken world. And that phrase really stuck with me.
Yeah.
And another person described feeling discrimination like death by 1,000 paper cuts. And you've talked a little bit about some of this already, but I'm curious to hear more from you about how the world does really limit options for people with disabilities.
I mean, there are many different kinds of limitations. There are, if you have a physical disability, there are a lot of physical barriers in the surroundings. But it can also be structural barriers and attitudinal barriers. And maybe if you have a developmental disability or a mental disability, the attitudinal barriers are even stronger. And I think there's one young man in the book who talks about, he has a mental disability, and he talks about the sort of the social oppression that he experiences, how hard it is for him to talk about his disability. He has this period in his life when he's in his early 20s where he calls it his coming out, just like a young gay man. He's trying to tell his friends, he's trying to talk to his family about his mental disability. and nobody really wants to talk to him. It's like they're constantly deferring that conversation to another time or to another place. And that place and that time is just never there. So these attitudinal barriers, the stigma, is really huge and obviously limits his life in a lot of ways, because there's this big part of him that nobody really wants to see. They don't want to talk about it. And obviously they don't appreciate it.
I know that one of the other aspects that comes up in the book is sort of this concept of social oppression that people with disabilities face. Is that an example of that, or do you think there was one that better illustrates it?
Oh, I think actually that's a good example of it. But there are other examples. There is I think it's a mother who has 3 sons on the autism spectrum, and she talks about the oppression in the school. All 3 boys are still in school, and even though the other kids in school and the teachers are actually nice to her sons, there's still a lot of oppression in the way that her sons are always eating by themselves at lunch. She finishes her story by saying, "Never let anybody eat alone at lunch." Mm-hmm. And I think that that's something we can all relate to, because it's like, not only is it a very lonely thing to eat by yourself, but it also sends a signal to everybody else that there must be something wrong with you, because nobody wants to sit with you. You must not be likable. Something must be strange about you.
Yeah. I know that social media really traffics a lot of stories. I don't know how else to describe it, about disabled people that get this inspirational label, and really they're examples of people simply treating other people decently or like human beings and going about their daily lives. And how does that inspiration label kind of strike the people you interviewed for the book? I know there were some stories about that in there.
I think there are actually quite a few. There is this young woman who is, I think she's almost completely blind now, and she loves shopping. She loves going to the mall and do some, she calls it a little bit of retail therapy when she's in a bad mood. She loves shopping and she loves trying out different clothes. And when she talks about that, people always are like, "Wow, you went to the mall by yourself?" It's like, you're so inspirational. How can you even do that? And she's like, "Well, it's just an ordinary thing for me. I do ordinary things. I don't want to be admired for doing completely typical things that other people do all the time." So I hear that all the time. That is so annoying. Being admired and being called inspirational for something that's completely ordinary or typical. You don't mind being inspirational or being admired if you've done something special, but just doing typical things is not very inspirational. Yeah. Sort of, it sends a signal that the surroundings have very low expectations. Like, oh, you can get up by yourself in the morning and have breakfast and go take a bus and get to your job. You're expected to just be sitting at home in the basement doing nothing because you're blind. That's kind of the way people experiences it.
So Senator Tom Harkin, who's the author of the Americans with Disabilities Act, wrote the foreword for your book. And he discussed some of what in his intro, kind of what you've already talked about, that a person's surroundings really are the true barrier and not the disability itself. But I know you're a lawyer and you've said that still laws aren't enough to solve these issues. So I'm curious, kind of touching off of what he says in the foreword and what you've learned in your career. I'm curious what you think, what most needs to change in order for people with disabilities to be more fully included in our society.
So I think globally, we have international laws. In the US, there are pretty strong legal regulations. We have the ADA is 30 years old this year. So there is pretty strong legal protection. There's still a lack of implementation of the laws in the US, and there's a desperate need of legal aid to be able to sort of enforce the rules. So there's still a large need of, those legal mechanisms for sure. But I think, and I might repeat myself from the beginning, that the attitudinal barriers, the lack of awareness and the lack of empathy and understanding is really a huge problem still. And that's, I think we need to work on these, different means. We can't just work on the improved legal protection. We have to work on those attitudinal barriers as well. And laws do send strong signals that are important in that regard, but we also need those individual narratives just to get a better understanding.
Speaking of laws, you, I think in another interview said the US has been a leader in some ways in disability rights and movements, but the US has yet to ratify the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And because you're more of an expert than I am, I'm wondering, what would it mean for the US to ratify that?
I think being part of the UN Convention, which is a convention that almost every country in the world has ratified now. So US is really one of the very few countries that haven't done so. And it would be a very powerful signal to send to the rest of the world if the US became a member. Right now, it's probably not very likely, but I'm hoping that it will be again in the future, because I think it would, send a signal to other countries that disability rights are indeed important human rights. I think that's very important. And the US, because of the strong domestic legislation, the US really has a lot of great experiences in this area that would be beneficial for the rest of the world to hear about. But obviously the position of the US is not as good, not being a member of this convention. So it would mean a lot to the rest of the world and to the US as well, being part of this convention. And it wouldn't really require any changes in the US legislation, at least not very major changes.
So I know that a number of US presidential candidates in the primary, in the Democratic primary, have released disability platforms, and there's been a lot of discussion about that. It feels new to me anyway, as an observer of politics. I'm curious, as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about these issues, what do you think that tells us, that this is a topic of discussion and debate in this campaign?
I think it shows that people with disabilities are not as invisible anymore as they once were, and that the candidates have realized that actually we have a lot of voters here that we need. So at least I'm sure that is part of it, getting in touch with this large group of voters that could mean a big difference. But I'm obviously also hoping that the candidates are just more aware of disability rights as important minority rights, like other minority groups. So there is sort of a combination of really improved awareness and much more visibility from people with disabilities and from groups and organizations of people with disabilities. So it's a very good sign. It's a very positive sign, I would say.
So I'm curious, in terms of the book, what kind of feedback have you gotten, I guess, both from the people who appear in the book and what it's meant for them, and also just from readers?
So I think for people who have been in the book, it's been a bit tough to see their stories on paper, but they still believe in the importance of doing so. but I'm just truly grateful that they actually chose to share their stories. Um, with regards to readers, I've been doing quite a lot of book events since the book came out, and one of the more, you can say, one of the bigger things has been that it's been very eye-opening for many people without disabilities, sort of to realize that disability is not just about medical diagnosis, that it's really about the barriers in the surroundings. And it's one of the most important things that I would like to promote, that disability is not about fixing the individual, it's about fixing the environment, fixing the surroundings, pulling down those barriers. And for many people, that's a new way of thinking. It's different, and if I can promote that, I would be just very, very happy. If more people will look at disability in that way, I think we would come a long, long way in promoting genuine equality.
One other thing I was wondering, in terms of that, is sort of what your hopes are for. I mean, you've talked a little bit about your hopes. I guess the better way to phrase it would be, how can those of us who are not disabled be better allies? How can we help sort of realize that vision that you've articulated?
How can we do that?
Big question. But.
Yeah, that is a big question. I think changing that focus from the individual who has an impairment, not that we are not supposed to be helpful and provide whatever assistance and accommodations that are needed, but that we don't limit our focus to the individual with an impairment, but really change it to the surroundings and just talk about those barriers, what's needed. I mean, as simple as, physical structures, building new physical structures. If you think about accessibility from the beginning, it's not more expensive, but it's always, the financial cost that prevents people from, building in accessible ways. But there's a lot of research showing that it's not more expensive. What's expensive is if you have to change it afterwards. So it's just one example, but really focusing on the surroundings and the environment instead of trying to fix the individual.
Yeah. So one of the last things I'm wondering is, how have the people you've met in the process of gathering information and writing this book, how has that changed your life or your perspectives?
So very much, I think, and it might sound like a cliche, but I learned a very big thing, which is what I've basically been promoting from a human rights perspective through all these years. But it's really that we are all just so much more alike than we're different. We really have the same basic needs and wants. We all want a home that's safe. We want to be able to be with our friends and family. We want to live a life in dignity. We want to be respected. We want to learn and go to school and have a job and be able to sustain ourselves and live independently. It's really all the same basic needs and wants that we have. And that's been one of the major sort of lessons for me on a more emotional level, because it's been what I've been preaching as a lawyer through all these years, because that's what international human rights are really all about. But it's been very, very clear on a more emotional level, talking to all these people. Yeah.
So lastly, I'm just wondering what's next for you in this work.
So I'm working on two different projects. One is another oral history project that I did while I lived in the US, which is focusing on the meaning of having a home. So I've been interviewing people who are or have been incarcerated, or people who are or have been homeless, or people who are in nursing homes or have a history of being in nursing homes. So that's one project that I'm working on. And then I'm working on a similar project as this from the Periphery project, but here in Denmark, because most of the time I spend in Denmark now. So I'm working on interviewing mostly young people with disabilities in Denmark, because I think it's really important what goes on in those young years. They're so formative for what we become later in lives.
Right.
Yeah.
Are you finding commonalities between those kinds of interviews you did in the US and the ones you're doing in Denmark?
It's interesting because our societies, or the societies, are so very different.
Yeah.
There is, in the US, because of strong disability rights legislation, there is actually very good accessibility, at least in a physical sense, structural sense. So if you have the means, if you can afford a wheelchair, for example, you can mostly get into the buses and you can get on the trains and you can get out and about. Whereas in Denmark, the welfare system is much stronger. So you would get a wheelchair from the government, but the inaccessibility out in the streets is really poor many places. So the result is kind of the same. You are isolated at home because either you cannot afford, like in the US, getting out, or like in Denmark, you can't get out because there's less accessibility. So very different systems. But my experience so far is really that the attitudinal barriers are kind of the same.
That makes sense.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much for answering those questions for me. I really appreciate it. And now I'm going to stop the recording. So a second.